I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land and the elders past, present, and emerging on whose lands we live and work and gather, whether it's virtually or physically. I'm here in Canberra on Ngambri and Ngunnawal people's lands, and I would like to acknowledge their elders past, present, and future as well. I would like to welcome you all to this first webinar in the Harmony Alliance's Intersectionality Discussion Series. I see a lot of you already know about Harmony Alliance or are somehow associated with us, but there are a lot of new names, a lot of new people who are joining in. So I will start with a very brief introduction about the Alliance and the work we have been doing on the intersectionality before handing over to the Chair of Harmony Alliance, Maria Pallotta-Chiarolli, who's present with us today, and she will convene the panel, the fantastic panel we have together today. So the Harmony Alliance is one of the 6 national women's alliances funded by the Federal Office for Women. We are the youngest alliance as well. We were established in 2017, and pretty much since the establishment of the alliance, there have been conversations about who do we represent, who do we speak for when we say migrant and refugee women. So the conversations about intersectionality initially started off as what does migrant and refugee women mean? Is it a homogenous group? What do we mean by women? So all of those broad categories, and who is it that we represent? And those conversations have been happening for a long time, but more recently, over the past year, we have also come to an agreement as the Alliance that any conversation we have with regards to intersectionality has to start with and has to be grounded in the context of the Aboriginal lands and the lands that we live on, and that we are benefactors of colonialism, ongoing colonialism, and dispossession of the Indigenous peoples of Australia. So that has really become a starting point of any conversation about intersectionality and rights of migrant and refugee women in this country for us, which is why this session is taking place. It started off with we wanted to develop a framework or a guidance note. We had multiple ideas that we played with, and we consulted our members, stakeholders over the course of the past year. We have accepted, rejected all sorts of document drafts in the drafting process, but then we agreed that we first need to establish our position and open it up for a conversation more publicly so that we can engage with the wider audience and hear from people who are either migrant or refugee women, or even the wider community, about their experiences and how we can try to be truly intersectional in our work and also guide policy and practice in the area. So that's the background. Before we get started, I will just a little bit of housekeeping about today. If you have any questions, can you please pop them into the Q&A feature of Zoom throughout the session. We will have about 40 minutes for dedicated to Q&A at the end of the session, but if we are getting more questions, we will adjust the speaking times as well. So there will be a lot of engagement and discussion. This session is all about discussion. And I have sent the Harmony Alliance's position statement as a document to most of you who have registered. But if you registered after the email went out or haven't received the position statement yet, I will pop the link into the chat for everyone to see, and you can, it's available on our website as well. You can download and share and discuss the statement with us during the session or afterwards. Thank you very much. Handing over to Maria Pallotta-Chiarolli. Thank you.
Sana, thank you. And if I too could start by acknowledging the context within which this particular webinar is happening. I am currently living and working on the lands of the Boonwurrung people, lands that were never ceded. And as you've rightly pointed out, and I think this will be a message that's consistently reiterated throughout today's discussion, and hopefully one that is fully embraced and entrenched in any conversations and actions that we might take around these topics. But of course, without that full, genuine acknowledgement of the dispossession of the First Nations people, and of course the legacy, the ongoing legacy of colonialism and of that dispossession needs to be addressed, and it needs to be done urgently, as so many of the community leaders, academics and others, activists in Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities have been saying for far, far too long. Look, this is a really exciting opportunity from our perspective. And it's an opportunity because I think it really aligns with what we would consider the praxis of harmony, meaning that we've really taken on board this idea of a dialogical process, an iterative one that really does reflect the sorts of conversations that our communities of women out there are having. One that truly doesn't sort of presuppose, but actually seeks to engage. And this is where this amazing group of women have come together to add considerable value to what has been the starting point of some of those conversations. Now, obviously, there's some baseline concepts that we've drawn on in the position paper, some fundamentals about intersectionality as an analysis of power, some drawing on the conversations that we've been having to date. But we don't want to feel limited by that, because we actually understand that concepts can also be misused and misunderstood. And I think we've all agreed that intersectionality is probably one of those concepts, which is why we thought that the start to this conversation would actually be around, well, what do we understand intersectionality to mean? Has it become so theorised, so misunderstood, so misapplied, that we've actually lost the usefulness of the term as activists in any meaningful way to our lives? So that's the conversation, really. I know each of these women, and I can guarantee that we are going to have a pretty dynamic conversation. I'm not going to say a lot more, folks, except perhaps to offer this particular quote, because I was sharing with the panelists just before we came on air that I'm probably old enough to actually reflect on experiences of the movement back in the 70s. And I was one of these privileged individuals that attended a women's conference in New York way back then. And I heard the great Audre Lorde, who sadly is no longer with us, talk about and reflect on what she called there is no hierarchy of oppression. And that's how she started the conversation. And I want to start with this quote because she says, "I was born black and a woman. I am trying to become the strongest person I can become, to live the life I've been given, and to help effect change towards a livable future for this earth and for all of my children. As a black, lesbian, feminist, socialist, poet, mother of two, including one boy, and a member of an interracial couple, I usually find myself part of some group in which the majority defines me as deviant, difficult, inferior, or sometimes just plain wrong. I cannot afford the luxury of fighting one form of oppression only." Audre Lorde, in my view, in many ways, I think captures what we understand to be intersectionality, of course, which has been built on and explored in a lot more detail. But let me introduce the panelists, because as I say, my ideal of moderation in conversations like this is to slowly sort of seep into the background and let these dynamic, incredible women take over. But Dr. Umber Rind is a Yamatji Badimaya woman who works as a GP in Melbourne's northern suburbs. She also works part-time with the Bubup Wilam, an Aboriginal child and family centre. She enjoys community work and works in both the health, education and anti-racism spaces. She's been an executive board member of the Islamic Council of Victoria and a Melbourne University graduate. And Umber, you have taken time today to be with us, despite the fact that you do run a clinic that you're doing some extraordinary work at the moment. And can I personally, and on behalf of all of us, thank you for that frontline exposure that I know you engage with daily. We appreciate your efforts, particularly here in Victoria. So thank you. Mary Lee is the Senior Project Officer as Family Safety Victoria, but as she keeps telling us, she is not representing the views and opinions of government right now. She is an individual, a member of the Harmony Alliance, we're proud to say, and is participating on the panel in a personal capacity. As I said, she works as a Senior Project Officer on the Intersectionality Capacity Building Project of Family Safety Victoria, but she's had a very long and extensive background in program development, workforce capacity building in the context specifically of family violence. And my dear friend, Dr. Maria Pallotta-Chiarolli, she is an academic, an author, an activist, and an absolute ally in issues of cultural diversity, gender diversity, sexual diversity, and family diversity. Maria's current research is with First Nations people with Southern European heritage, exploring the contestations and connections between colonialism, racism, and multiculturalism. I can't wait, Maria, for the book. I've been waiting now. I hope you're using this ISO time to finish it. Her publications include over 13 books. Nothing. 13 books, several having achieved awards. Her latest book project was Living and Loving in Diversity, an anthology of Australian multicultural queer adventures, which was funded by VMC Mask and also for AGMC. No doubt you'll hear from each of these amazing women a little bit more about how their own lives have intersected with the many of the issues that they're going to talk about. But I started the conversation really by reflecting on what I think has been an interesting evolution around a term that many accredit to Kimberly Crenshaw, but I often, again, as someone who's, grappled with the 70s and the 80s, I think, it's not like Black women, First Nations women waited until the 1990s before this term was coined. I mean, we often hear of Sojourner Truth and her sort of incredible statement around "Ain't I a Woman" way back in the sort of 1800s, really. But so the evolution of this term and the kinds of concepts that it brings up is one that really has an interesting currency at the moment. But Umber, when I think about intersectionality, what does it mean to you?
I'd just like to say thank you so much for that very generous welcome. So I really appreciate it. I want to start with acknowledging first the traditional owners of the land I am on, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and I want to pay my respects to their leaders, past, present, and emerging. I'd also like us all to remember and acknowledge that we are on Aboriginal land. This land was never ceded, and this always, has been, always was, and always will be Aboriginal land. So what does intersectionality mean to me? It can be a very complex kind of, when we talk about this topic, to look at it, but sometimes I think we need to simplify it. So the way I look at it is how does it apply to Aboriginal people such as myself. So if you are not an Aboriginal person in Australia, then you are a settler on this land in some form or some way. And I think everyone needs to acknowledge Australia's colonial history. I think any conversation should always centre on Aboriginal sovereignty at the basis of anything. And always remember how a lot of issues are interconnected. So when you hear on the news about police brutality, black deaths in custody, the health inequalities, even broader issues of the environmental impacts of colonisation, it always comes back to us considering how this has affected not only Aboriginal people but the land itself. I think we also have to remember that it's always not just about a personal identity, because all of us, in this era of individualism, we all like to just look at ourselves and talk about ourselves. But I think we have to also consider the broader conversations and look at broader privileges and things and how these intersect with each other. So in the sense, the way I consider and look at myself, I'm perceived as a migrant. I have a very complex history, which I won't go into, but I have Camellia and both Aboriginal ancestry. So I'm visibly Muslim. So I will cop Islamophobia out there in the community, in the wider Australia community, of course I will. And then if I mention I'm an Aboriginal and my history, then I will both experience racism, not only from broader the Australian community, but also sadly amongst multicultural communities who some people, lack education, they're ignorant, and then there are some people, and I'm sad to say, who do harbour, racist and almost bigoted kind of ideas. So that's kind of the way I look at it in terms of how I apply it to myself and how I look at it in a broad sense.
Thanks for that, Umber. And Mary, for you, intersectionality, I know you often talk to me about interconnected solidarities and that for you as an activist, it frames your practice. But is that how it comes through for you?
I think so. And firstly, I too would like to acknowledge the traditional lands on which I'm working on, the Bunurong people, as well as the lands on which we are all virtually meeting on, and pay my respects to elders past and present and to any other First Nations participating in this meeting. I'd also like to acknowledge that sovereignty was never ceded and this land is and always will be Aboriginal land. And like what Umber said, I want to acknowledge that as migrant settlers to this land, we have and we still benefit from colonisation. And whatever we do to advance any sort of progress, we do so in centering the experiences of First Nations peoples. As Maria said in my introduction, all these opinions are expressed on this panel are mine and mine alone. And I think, drawing on the things that Umber's spoken about, intersectionality for me, it's a way of understanding how systems and structures within society are set up and organised, and they do benefit and privilege some people who look as though they're from the dominant culture, and they will marginalise and oppress others in different ways. It also is intersectionality, I really believe, it asks us to have these really hard and really often uncomfortable conversations so we can actually move beyond these quick fixes. We do a lot of quick fixes with social inequality, and it forces us to start addressing social inequality in ways that are really truly meaningful. I think that this quote from the Centre for Intersectional Justice, which Professor Kimberly Crenshaw is the president of, also eloquently summarises what it means. It is that intersectionality is about fighting discrimination within discrimination. It's about tackling inequalities within inequalities and protecting minorities within minorities. It's always about looking at power and privilege and oppression and marginalisation, and how we all play a part in either aligning to power or, just playing a part in that.
Thanks, Mary. And Maria, I know that you've worked extensively on these issues, particularly in research, those intersections of class, race, gender that I mentioned even in the introduction in your bio. More recently, I've also heard people sort of talk about intersectionality or intersectional theory as having an urgency about it. I mean, is that something that's coming through in your work and your understanding of the application of intersectionality?
Yeah, thank you, Maria. And I would like to start with an acknowledgement, because I'm actually in Tandanyaga with the European name, which is Adelaide. It's Ghana Nation. And my background is ethnic settler, colonizer, I call it, the Italian migrants who came here. And if I could just say, part of acknowledging our positions, as Mary and Umber have said, is the fact that the reason why my parents came out here was because of a fascist war where the Italians were colonizing Northern Africa, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Somalia. So part of my work in intersectionality is to acknowledge that I am coming to land, or my parents came to land as colonizers from a country that was colonizing. And we know in Somalia, it had its own stolen generation. So that would be part of what we're doing. And I feel so privileged now because I've had Umber and Mary just give these incredible presentations. And I feel like, hey, that's so easy for me to add on. I really acknowledge the discomfort of being an academic and an ally and an advocate and an activist, because I totally get what you're saying, Maria, that sometimes language, suddenly someone thinks they have invented or discovered, hey, Umber, you know, we discover what has always been there, but people did not have the ability or were given the opportunity to say, I actually know this. I may not have the language that suits the colonizer. Intersectionality is very important to look at diversity within, to acknowledge the fact, as Mary said, that there are parts of us that to different degrees we are privileged. I work with a lot of LGBTIQ plus people who want to belong to their faiths, want to belong to the queer community, want to belong to their cultural communities. But everywhere they go, as Gloria Anzaldúa said, part of them is accepted, part of them is not. So the discomfort we have to live in is, how do we ally for each other? How do we support the intersectionalities of each other? But my concern with the use of that word, Maria, is the fact that it can be co-opted into tick the box. Okay, grant money is coming through, therefore we'll make sure we use this term, without acknowledging what it means and without acknowledging that we have to look at our own practices. We have to look at our own privileges in how we do this work, how we research, and how we look at these broader concepts of privilege and power that we're in. And I don't know if that's answered your question, but I feel like
no, but so this might be a question that I put to all of you as well, because you know that term intersectionality in the late 1980s and so on, there was a view, though, wasn't there, that despite what Kimberly Crenshaw and others, and in an Australian context, kept saying, this isn't just a series of add-ons, that the additive sort of approach is all wrong. And the conversation that we've just had is there a danger here that it's been watered down, that that conversation around power and privilege doesn't feature as centrally as perhaps it should? Is there an argument to be made that maybe, particularly within a context like Black Lives Matter and the current sort of dialogue that's happening, that we almost kind of now need to use the preface structural intersectionality? I mean, is this a better way to start getting us to think about those ideas of privilege? Mary, you look like you're about to offer a view.
I think, honestly, I find it really hard when we start adding on words to words, because I think we do a disservice to it. I think it comes down to us really educating and having these kind of conversations about intersectionality, because I find that today it's really hard that people like to use intersectionality as a word to replace diversity, as though they are the exact same thing. And they aren't, because I think we have to start really talking about intersectionality from the frame of addressing social inequalities and how we can actually advocate and drive for justice and inequality, and most importantly, centre the people who are most marginalised and oppressed within our systems and structures. Like what you said, Maria, about the Black Lives Matter movement globally, and how in the US, with Kimberly Crenshaw right now, she's been doing a series of webinars called Under the Black Light. So using this opportunity not just on Black Lives Matter, but also the pandemic to really highlight the systemic inequalities and continue to have this dialogue, this kind of conversation looking at the systemic marginalization of people under the concept of intersectionality. I think there is a danger when we start adding words to words, it starts to dilute that conversation, and it kind of dilutes the meaning behind the concepts and the work that you do towards them.
Umber, is it a useful concept within a First Nations sort of conversation that's happening right now? And again, I keep stressing that idea of urgency. I mean, we saw so much happening around the Black Lives Matter movement, and I think the fear or concern is somehow that will get dissipated as we broaden this idea of coalition politics, that the centrality of the First Nations struggles and the need for those non-First Nations people to really address those issues of dispossession, power and so on. Is intersectionality a meaningful concept, in your view, to those kinds of struggles? You're on mute, Umber.
No, I was just saying, absolutely, I agree. It's definitely relevant, and the reason I say that, and I agree with what Mary was trying to say, that trying to complicate terms and confuse everyone is I don't feel like it's that useful. As long as anyone who's approaching this issue who's non-Aboriginal remembers that you know, the inequalities and barriers that we talked about years ago, they still exist today. So they're it's not, they haven't disappeared. The institutions that have been built on the back of colonialism, on the back of slavery and all these things, they continue, you know, all around us, and they benefit different groups disproportionately. For example, white Australia still benefits from the fact that the land was stolen. Their families have been able to build great wealth and things as a result of that in the Australian context. And I always try and bring it back. I don't want to ever talk as like an academic or anything. I'm a GP, so I have to use my medical understanding of things. So if you look at how people can study medicine, for example, in this country, and you look at medical students, a lot of medical students, you have to get high marks. Now, it's proven time and time again the children that are getting the higher marks are from privileged private schools. In order for you to go to a privileged private school, you have to have money and wealth. So that's where the disparities continue. And unfortunately, I've seen them going through the medical system. I've seen it in the hospital system, training, specialty training programs, in order for you to become a surgeon or a physician or, anything like that. There is a lot of nepotism. There are families that are interconnected. So this is something that we all know happens. It's not openly, discussed, but you can see that these power structures and privileges kind of still occur. So I think it's highly relevant, and that in order for things to change, we need to make it a more level playing field. So that means some people who have had an advantage and have had that power and privilege have to be willing to give it up in order to make it fair. And I know that's not an easy thing. Nobody wants to give up their power and privilege, unfortunately.
And do you think, Mary, I know that you're not wanting necessarily to talk per se about your work with FSV, but just in taking up what Umber said in the application, I mean, if this is an analysis of power and privilege, access to services, if we think about issues like family violence, sexual violence, how does an intersectional analysis actually enable us to have a better understanding of issues of access and equity, of people's ability to be able to report and expect that they're going to receive proper services? I mean, this is where perhaps the accusation that's often made around intersectionality is it's over-theorised to such an extent that it's become nebulous and meaningless. If we really want to get serious about it as an analytical tool, then it's got to impact surely on practice and outcome. If you could draw on your experiences in working around family violence, sexual violence, how do you see the difference when you apply an intersectional lens to, say, someone's ability to report and expect appropriate and prompt service?
Yep. Thank you for asking that question. I'm going to have to really think about this, because I think it's one of these things where we talk about intersectionality, like you said, as though it's this analytical concept. So it sits up here and in the ether. And in reality, if we're really living and trying to breathe and do the work of intersectionality, it starts with self-interrogation and self-analysis. We have to understand our positions of power and privilege within society, within our organizations, within the work that we do, because from there we can actually look at how we can influence people through our sphere of influences. But also it has to be a point where we start being really, we have to interrogate ourselves, because we're going to hear confronting things. People are going to tell us that the system isn't working. The system has been built in such a way where, as policymakers, we drive change because we truly believe that what we're doing will make a difference. And when we hear the voices of service users tell us that it's actually not working, that can be quite confronting. And our first response is to move back and close ranks and say, no, that's not the case. You're just not accessing the service system correct. And I think it has to start from that self-interrogation and the self-analysis, so we can really start unpacking what that means for us and how we can really address the systemic issues. Hope that helps.
Maria, do you want to offer a comment, I suppose particularly given the work that you've done around what broadly you might call sexualities and diversity, and we've all said that, you know, intersectionality isn't just a synonymous term for diversity, it's much more structural in its thinking. How might it apply to the work that you're doing?
It's what Mary said about the uncomfortable conversations of acknowledging a range of privileges: class privilege, heterosexual privilege, gender binary, cisgendered privilege, and how that sits within broader concepts of privilege, broader concepts of community and belonging. And that self-interrogation is really important. And also for me, Maria, it's about the fact that these things shift. I may have been born into what white Australia saw as working class, no English, etc., migrant background. But I am now, uncomfortably and comfortably, a middle, very well educated, affluent, established migrant. Therefore, what are my responsibilities and my accountability to emerging communities, to the ongoing unceded colonialism? How do I sit in neo-colonialism? Do we challenge words like post-colonialism? Is Australia a post-colonial country, given what Umber is saying, given what we know? So we need to do exactly that interrogation of language. And cultural amnesia, Maria, and historical amnesia. Do some people who come into this country forget what they went through, whose country they're coming on, and take up a position of privilege for white colonizer, or try and get there at the expense of new communities? We're seeing that with COVID. We're seeing it the way people are hurting, destroying each other within a broader framework that doesn't shift, as Umber's made very clear. So I would add those terms. It's not about equality.
Yeah.
I don't think it's about diversity or inclusion. It's about equity. We all have to examine. I may be trying to work for gender privilege. I may be trying to work for class privilege. But am I actually still using my culture, my faith, my gender to oppress someone who is not LGBT, who is not straight, for example?
Yeah, just sorry, Umber, you look like you're about to say something.
I just wanted to jump in there because I did see someone didn't like that I'd mentioned private schools, and that it's not only the wealthy and privileged that send their children to private schools. So that's what I mean about uncomfortable conversations. I'm not generalizing that every single person out there who sent their child to a private school is super rich and they haven't struggled, but you have to admit that there is a discrepancy in wealth and in privilege in this country. So that's the conversation that I think we need to have, and trying to dismiss it or get upset about it and take things personally is part of how we work through intersectionality, is not to take some of these statements as a personal thing, but understand how it applies in the broader Australian context.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. I was going to touch on that issue, though, of a proposition that intersectionality has become divisive, that it's become exclusionary, that we no longer feel like we're all part of the gender discussion anymore. I mean, this idea that intersectionality is actually reinforcing difference. And Mary, I know you've spoken over the time about this, that, you know, is it about difference, and is it about reinforcing or amplifying those differences when people are yelling out that now more than ever we need to draw on our commonalities? I mean, what views do you have on that?
Oh, I have a lot of views.
I know. That's why we put the question.
I think when people say intersectionality is divisive, they're saying this because they want to divide us. And they want us to use intersectionality to replace diversity. Because when we're talking about diversity and inclusion, we don't actually look at addressing the power imbalances and the privileges. Like what Maria was also saying, we look at these things as though they're add-ons. We don't generally have this more nuanced discussion about them. I think it's hard because it's about having those hard conversations. Like Umber said, we need to have these really uncomfortable conversations because we have to put ourselves in those positions to really address the issues. Because what's happening now is the same kind of conversation years ago, but we don't talk about power and privilege. And I think intersectionality gives us an opportunity to really do that. It actually gives us the chance to say, hey, let's talk about this from our own positions. Let's talk about them from our individual lived experiences, but we have to understand the lived realities. There are lived realities that people will experience, like Patricia Hill-Collins talks about, that there are structural inequalities that impact a lot of people who are based on their ethnicity, based on their abilities, their sexuality. Those things are real things that are systemic issues, and we can't dismiss them. We actually have to have these conversations so we can really address the issues.
Yeah. There are some great questions that are coming through, so I might take the opportunity, if that's all right with each of you, to read some of them. This one is a really critical one, obviously, as they all are, but when we talk about intersectionality and how it impacts or influences the everyday life experience of women from diverse backgrounds in Australia, it's often seen or framed as a complex issue by policy people, planners, service providers, and not enough attempt or efforts have been made to understand the context using an intersectionality lens. How would you respond to this mentality or trend? How can we change that mindset to enable women from diverse backgrounds and empower them? How long do we have to address the issue of marginalisation of women from diverse backgrounds? So I think, in essence, if I can paraphrase some of that, there is that thing, isn't there? Oh, it's too complex, it's too hard, we can't actually apply this in any meaningful way. And so effectively, yet again, it doesn't act or serve those of us who are fighting for this kind of framing or discussion. It ends up sort of yet again failing to address what it is that we need to address. Maria, did you have a thought on that?
Yes, you can see my little finger coming up on the top. I find, and this is where the different parts of me really clash and sit uncomfortably on my shoulders. I find it deeply offensive that people with privilege and power can go, it's all too hard, it's all too complex, when people are living this every day. When people are going through a pandemic every day, you don't have to wait for COVID to come in. People in this world are living pandemics of all sorts every day in this country right now. It's deeply offensive when I have to work with people who go, it's all too hard, it's all too complex, you are making this too hard. You are, no. This is being lived. We can simplify the language. We can stop talking about it and do some walking, do some work, and center and listen to the very people who are living this every day. Without all our highfalutin language, the language is supposed to be a tool to do this work. But we can't, it's called white fragility. Robin DiAngelo, as you all know, wrote very beautifully about it. Those people with power and privilege then suddenly become the victim, or they say they become fragile or uncomfortable. It's deeply offensive to take that view. Sit with the discomfort, sit with the complexity, because our job is that there's people living this, and our role is to work with that and acknowledge it's something that needs to be done. Private schools, acknowledge the privilege if you are able to take your child to a private school. Acknowledge that privilege. Sit with the discomfort of that. And what are you doing to work with equity? You know, those kinds of things. Sorry, it's a very difficult, it's very, and maybe it's triggering me, Maria, because I've had to work with academics who use that distancing, disengaging. It's all too hard. What are you doing?
Umber, you were nodding quite vigorously there. Again, because you do see, as a medical practitioner, as an activist, as someone who's shown incredible leadership on these issues within your own communities, how do you meet those sort of complaints that it's too hard, Umber? Stop introducing concepts when it's hard enough for us to deal with what's going on right now.
Yeah, those kinds of things, I do take it a little bit personally, because people who have been privileged, and it's usually, I'll be honest, it's someone, for example, when I used to work in the hospital system, let's say a Caucasian doctor will say, oh, you've got a chip on your shoulder, or things aren't as bad as it seems. Well, you didn't have to live the day that I did. Like, for example, I could be abused by a patient because I had one patient who swore at me and wouldn't let me put a cannula in their arm for IV antibiotics because I have a scarf on. And so I could go throughout the day being disrespected, being talked down to, not only by patients, but by midwives, nurses, you know, disrespected on all levels. And then when you express that you're frustrated and you don't get the same level of respect or acknowledgement within, let's say, the hospital system, they think you have a chip on your shoulder. So I think, and that's because they don't want to hear it. They want to hear that everything's okay. And I think it's wrong. And I did call people out on it, and it did make for very uncomfortable situations in tea rooms and things, in doctors' tea rooms. But I think if we don't call it out and correct or point out that behaviour every day, people are just going to continue doing it. And how do you expect to create any change around you if you're not doing it within your local, with people around you? So I think it's very important.
Yeah. Mary, you wanted to offer a comment?
Yeah, just very quickly. I think we need to start looking at our language. You know, it becomes complex because we talk about people from diverse communities, because we can't figure out a way to really address what is invisible, that there is a dominant narrative within Australia that we're not dealing with. Specifically for migrant and refugee women, it's also looking at how racism has played a part in this, and how when you start trying to address these issues, society as a whole through media or whatever will come down very harshly on you because you're not a good migrant, you're not the good foreigner, you don't play by the right cards. And I think it's really important that we start talking about it from a bigger picture, about that we are here in Australia as all of us, unless we're First Nation people, migrant settlers here. So we are from diverse communities in that sense. And it isn't a complex issue. It's just it's an issue that people don't want to talk about because it's an uncomfortable conversation, because it's shining the lights on the issues within our society. And as a few of us have said, sometimes it's easier to look at the nice and shiny, the good things in our society, than it is to really address the hard, harsh reality.
Thanks, Mary. There are quite a number of other questions and comments that are coming through. I'm going to spend some time and texting me, folks. So for all those friends out there that think they can text me on my mobile, do it properly. But I am going to, there's a question here around ageism, and how does ageism relate with understandings of intersectionality? We see more and more young people simply accepting intersectional understandings as their truth. What do you see from young people in your communities that push you and your evolution of understanding of intersectionality? Any of the panelists who want to address that one? Maria, a nod.
Oh, I love it. I'm picked up on my personal pronoun misuse all the time
Right. Yeah.
by younger non-binary and gender diverse people. And
Yeah.
on one hand, I think younger generations have the privilege maybe of coming into a society where we have got maybe this far, but may become offensive if they're not learning or being taught about what led to this. And sometimes some of that lack of understanding of what some other communities are experiencing is because if they're okay, and I see this with some young LGBTIQ people, they're fine now without, why is there a problem anymore, without understanding the intersections that maybe a Muslim young person or maybe an Italian young person who's gay may be experiencing issues that a white, gay young person won't experience. So, but I think our education system really has to teach young people the history of this. When I have a neoliberal young feminist, white feminist telling me, what's the problem? We're all okay now. This is where we need education. What got her to a position where she's able to sit there and say that, and who is not able to say that? And what is her role as an ally? Because, I love this conversation. I feel like one thing we're missing is that sometimes the very people who are experiencing oppression, experiencing difficulty, are expected to constantly call out Umber, are expected to constantly put themselves in that firing line. Those of us who have more privilege in whatever way, let's be the active, not appropriating, but appropriate allies to stand up and call things out if we have less to lose by that.
There is that danger, though, isn't there, that in calling out that behaviour, we do end up appropriating or using platforms really that inadvertently reinforce the very power position that we're seeking to address. And Umber, in terms of being a good ally, I mean, you talked about the daily experience and how that shifts and changes your lived experience and how you kind of might react to certain situations. But if allies around you were going to truly enable and support that opportunity for you to feel empowered by some of that stuff, what would that look like without that danger of appropriation, of stepping up? And so I often hear, I know how you feel. Well, do you?
Yeah. I think the basic step is just listening and not saying that, oh, it's not that bad, or that situation, or you must have misinterpreted. It's hearing what I'm saying and actually acknowledging that that behavior is wrong and that some of the systems in place are wrong and inherently unequal. Like I said, I always refer to the medical system because that's what I'm familiar with. And that. You can see, I mean, this is as a young student, I used to go and stand at Royal Melbourne Private and look at all the names on the names of doctors, and you don't see many, brown names there. They're all Caucasian names. So I'm not discounting that those people didn't work hard and they don't deserve to be there. But you think we're all, when I was a med student, we had about a third of the class were you could say Asian, about a third were Indians and others, and then a third were white. So why is it that by the time everybody finishes, the best specialty positions are taken up by a white majority, and then everyone seems to be scattered amongst the GP land and other kind of specialties? So you can see, I saw that inequality, and I'll be honest, interims, when we all sit there and there isn't anyone, if I can speak openly, anyone white around, this is what we talk about. And when we feel safe with each other, we all doctors, a lot of them, will say how racist and almost rigged some of these systems are. So I know this is very uncomfortable for some people, but that's the truth. And that's how we speak when no one else is around.
But I think you're all unanimously saying is those points of discomfort are an absolute precondition if we're going to get real change. But Mary, why would I, if I'm a white privileged human being, why would I want to give up that power? I mean, this is the challenge, isn't it? Where in any sort of era, as I see this struggle unwind, and I feel like I'm Groundhog Day constantly, it almost feels like, yes, the language may be changing, but my goodness, we were having these kinds of conversations 30 years ago. Is there something that we're fundamentally missing as activists who are determined to create the right conditions for change? Are we missing that question of why should power be given up?
I feel like you're giving me these really hard questions.
Because Mary, you and I were having these conversations
look,
at 2 in the morning.
So I think the real question here is, do I want that power?
Right. Okay.
Like, do I want to have access to that particular type of power?
Okay.
Do I want to align to that kind of power and assimilate to structures that are set up to not benefit me or others like me? So then my question to that would be, actually, if you want that power and you don't want to give it up to me, that's fine. You take that. I want to build my own table, and I want to have people at that table who want to look at these things from a collective issue, that these issues are not single issues. Like, you know, I always think about in the words of Dr. Lila Watson, if you come to help me, you're wasting your time. But if you've come because your liberation is bound up with mine, then let us work together. I think we need to start looking at that. And if we're really looking at, you know, dismantling structures and systems, it is about going, what can we build that actually benefits people for social justice and equity? What actually will support people? And how do we harness that kind of power and privilege? Because we still talk about power and privilege from this kind of dominant narrative. And I don't want that power. I don't want to have an individualistic power, because that benefits no one but me. I will sit and I see this happen. We see this happen in our communities, that whenever people ascend to positions of power, they start copying what they think is right. They start copying this kind of unspoken rules about how you need to work. And they forget what it actually means to be part of a collective. They forget that it is about centering those voices and always doing things for the betterment of all of us.
Certainly one of those conversations that you mentioned earlier, Mary, that Kimberly Crenshaw is having, that Angela Davis is having, there's a number of conversations that are taking place. And again, very much within the context of the Black Lives Matter movement, of looking at these whole issues of policing and over-policing of communities, you know, the role of prisons in our society. I mean, these are very big social conversations that we're having that obviously go beyond the discussion around gender. Now, one of the conversations I guess I wanted to draw us back on, and I've noticed some comments that are coming through, is that, is there a danger again that intersectionality has watered down the centrality and importance of gender? And some people that are saying, look, let's face it, at the end of the day, gender discrimination, no matter what the context, will repeatedly feature in the marginalisation of women across our communities. I mean, for me, I like to sort of revert back to what Patricia Hill-Collins talks about. Intersectional thinking is actually about social justice for all. It's actually a human rights framework. That gender is a construction. I mean, any thoughts on this? Because there is some pushback that I'm seeing even in the conversations that Angela Davis is having, the conversations that Kimberly Crenshaw is having. There's this push that, look, those kinds of movements are actually taking us away from hard-fought gains about gender liberation, around feminism as we once knew it. I mean, what are your thoughts on this? Are we watering it down, or are we actually reaching a higher level, an idea about freedom and liberation is something that we're all bound up in? What are your thoughts? Maria? You're on mute.
I don't think it is watering down unless it is sabotaged by those people in privilege. I think it is saying this is a new term, a new tool, and women have lived and women have done, and we have got to this point with all our complexities, beauties, everything. Some women have more power than others because of a whole range of other factors, intersectional factors, and within the context and structures they're in. Those women need to step up and be allies and support other women, but acknowledging that this power is much more fluid, that structures and systems, that women, different types of women are positioned in different points, aspects, and how do we use that? So I don't think it's watering down. I think that, as Umber and Mary are saying, people are pushing back because we are getting to deeper and deeper and more, you know, issues that really require this thinking that you may have privilege and you cannot fall back on a particular homogenized title like gender. Which woman? From where? What else? Are the questions we all ask. What's your responsibility? What's your vulnerability? Where do you work with that? Are you an ally? When are you not an ally? When do you need an ally?
Yeah. I mean, it's very interesting, isn't it, that this idea that intersectionality is divisive or it waters down. If anything, in my view, it expands the terrain around what humanness might look like in some ways. It really looks at the structural inequalities and asks that question from a human rights perspective of what does true dignity look like. So I'm often dismayed at this idea that somehow we're watering down all that hard work that's being done around gender discrimination. Mary, you look like you've got some thoughts as well on this one, but please, what do you think? I mean, you work in work-life family violence, and we constantly hear, don't shift the narrative around the primacy of gender. There's a danger if we do that. What do you think?
I think, again, like most of these concepts and these issues that we're living with, they're broader issues. And it isn't about doing a disservice. It's about honouring what the foundations were. It's about honouring the legacies and improving. Because if we're talking about our humanity, we should be always trying to improve ourselves as humans. Like I think about gender-based violence and what has happened internationally. There has been a rise in child sex abuse of young boys because they have been invisibilized, because there's been a focus on women and girls in some of the, developing countries. And I think about these issues, about how when we use particular words, we invisibilize people. But I also understand that sometimes there is context and there is moments where you want to focus on particular genders as well. So sometimes you want to talk about women and girls. You want to talk about boys and men. You want to talk about gender diverse people. There's always going to be the complexity in that, and always looking at it from the situational analysis and going, what's the benefit from using this kind of language? And what
but intersectionality asks for contextual analysis. Surely it doesn't dismiss it.
No, it doesn't. Yeah, and I think that's why it's perfect to to look at intersectionality, because it does draw us into looking at what are we missing and what do we invisibilize when we aren't addressing these issues.
Yeah. There's a number of questions as well here about, again, that application. I think people are really wanting to hear more from each of you, given the years of experience that you've had in applying these ideas and concepts in real life situations. There's a question here of, yes, this is a very important conversation and we have to have the uncomfortable conversations. But if you had the ability to introduce one policy decision to drive action and change, what would that be? Umber?
That's a really hard question, because I have no experience with policy or anything. I mean, I would make sure whenever you do introduce a policy that you look at all those intersections. Like I bring it back to a medical point of view, I mean, make the system more fair. I mean, maybe there needs to be a check and balance system, and don't discount people's experience and knowledge and just put others there just through family connections and things. Make systems more transparent and fair. is how I look at it. I can't make up policy.
But in the current environment, though, particularly with COVID, where many are saying that whole sort of situation has amplified these inequities, it's really brought them to the fore in terms of access to health, the way that health messaging has impacted. The disparities really are laid bare. I mean, if there was going to be something that came out of this from that health perspective that took an intersectional lens, what would you be saying to policy makers out there? What are the lessons that could be drawn?
And I'd be saying, if you look at a lot of people who have missed out, casual workers and things, who haven't been eligible for a lot of payments, I know I have experience with single mothers, you know, they're not able to send their children to childcare. How are they supposed to work from home? So I've had 2 or 3 conversations with different women today doing mental health plans because they can't cope. One woman has 3 children under 4. And she's working in a very high functioning position as job, but from home, and she can't send her children to childcare. So I think just making sure that we're, I guess, thinking about all options and making systems a bit more fairer for everyone.
No, they're really important lessons. Mary?
Yeah, I want to second that. And I think it's about asking those kind of questions, like who is writing the policy? What voices are informing the policy development? Also, what are those societal impacts of a particular policy position? And how will we address it through the other policies out there? Like, how do we work as wherever we're doing our policies, how do we work across organizations to go, hey, let's look at doing this from a collective response. Like, what is our collective position on these issues? How do we actually look at these from broader social inequality areas, and how do we address this? So whatever I'm working on actually looks at how we can influence and adapt our advocacy and policy direction across multiple society, multiple social inequalities.
And Mary, just before I go to Maria, though, on that, there's also that question that's coming through, particularly to you, you know, as someone within who is contributing to making policy. And I know you didn't want to necessarily offer comment about your position as a bureaucrat, but is it easy to change the dominant culture from the outside than from within? Just given what you just said.
So, okay, these are my own opinions. I think, regardless of where you are, the dominant culture is there. It doesn't matter if you're in government or non-government. Like, we're seeing this through academia. We're seeing this through childcare. We're seeing it through everything. I think it takes time. And I think in Australia, we haven't really recognize the impact of colonization. Like, we don't even talk about colonization and the ongoing impact on First Nations people. Like, we're not taught about that in education, where we've talked a particular narrative. And I think it goes to these bigger things. We have to start addressing and interrogating, asking questions. I think it's really uncomfortable, and wherever I've been, being the person to ask questions, because people assume that it's a personal attack on them. But I'm questioning because I want to understand the legacies. I want to understand the histories of why we've gotten to this point and why there are still so many people missing out. So I think it's challenging no matter where you work and no matter what you're doing, even when you're out in community trying to make change with other people who you think align with your own values. You kind of find out half the time that they don't, because they're aligning to a dominance narrative. They want that power and privilege from the particular look, because it looks nice to be able to be that person in a prominent role. So I think no matter where it is really hard, and it can get really ugly and uncomfortable, but I think we have to just keep doing it.
Maria,
I would, just a couple of practical things, maybe.
Yes, yeah.
I really would draw attention to the Islamic Council of Victoria, who set out some fantastic guidelines on how to do research, how to write policy, how to work in community. They're available. I can make them available to Harmony Alliance, but they're on the Islamic Council of Victoria. I know the AGMC, the Australian LGBTQ Multicultural Council, use them. And they are doing that collective work. Okay, if we're going to do a project, here are some guidelines, because unfortunately, as Umber knows, and I'm sure many of the women and people listening in today, you know, the Islamic Council was constantly being approached for data around terrorism and all these, you know, which fitted a particular political grant model. So they said, no, we're going to take control. These are the questions we will ask before we, you know, and are you going to co-design, collaborate with us? Another very thing we did is with AGMC, the research we're doing at the moment in the final point, and Maria, thank you for being so amazing in supporting us and writing this up, to get that grant. We took a settings approach. Okay, LGBTIQ, what's it like? What kinds of racism and other forms of discrimination do you experience in a gay venue? Do you experience in your synagogue? Do you experience at your cultural festival? What's happening in each of those spaces, so that you get a bigger picture of your life, as Umber said, from the moment you wake up in the morning, what's the microaggression? What's the everydayness of wherever you go? How does this look? What happens? The latest Victorian discussion paper is a really good one to look at on LGBTIQ strategies. The discussion paper sets out very clearly the different factors that need to be engaged in. And a very simple question I would ask, which is dear to my heart right now, we're talking about statues and monuments. Those of us who come from migrant backgrounds, before we put up something, you know, whose land are we putting up a monument? Whose land, you know, Joseph Pugliese, shout out to Joseph, and who talks about migrant, I'm sounding nerdy now, migrant historiography, which is when you put up something to acknowledge your migrant heritage, on whose land, acknowledge where this statue or whatever you're doing is on. And that's just a very simple thing we could all be doing in our local communities.
Just on that though, Maria, it was very interesting for me when we were working on that project, just how hard it was to get that money, even within so-called progressive thinking. And I was reminded as you were talking, you know, in the wake of tragedies around the world, and particularly the United States rather, where the murder of people like Kelly Stowe and other transgender trans women, and particularly trans black women, that it seemed that all of a sudden the fervour around intersectionality and the politics around shared solidarity diminished. And I wonder if there is that thing about, despite what we're saying, is that there is still that idea that some oppression is going to draw greater levels of support and solidarity than others. And I do feel there is this greater oppression or oppressive silence around some of the discourse of trans communities within our own multicultural environments and contexts. Is that something you're seeing? And how do we resolve those tensions when we're really calling for shared intersectional practice? We're calling for, you know, flexible solidarity, to use some of the terminology that Angela Davis and others use. What are your thoughts on that? Because it's a harder place to be, isn't it?
It is, and trying to be briefer. I mean, the first thing, for example, that is something that our multicultural, multi-faith communities have to address. When we talk about tradition, we also need to interrogate whose tradition. Is it a particular, so when I work with, say, Pacifica Islanders, and they talk about the Fa'afafine, the beautiful, what we would call trans, but they would talk about their spiritual, beautiful, non-binary leaders. That was a Christian missionary divisive concept that came in and destroyed the beauty of trans or non-binary people. So we're going to have to look at, well, when we talk about maintaining our heritages, whose heritages? What has been forgotten? Is there a neo-colonial way of going, well, some of the leaders of our communities have also adopted what were once colonial views in looking at certain issues. So all of that, and you've really drawn attention to racism at its most blatant. There is something called the missing white girl syndrome. And I was thinking about this, Mary, when you spoke, that some wonderful Canadian writers. I can't remember right now. I'm terrible with names, aren't I, Umber? But there's a beautiful paper that some First Nations Canadian women wrote and said, for every white child that goes missing and gets lots of media attention, there'll be so many children from First Nations background. We're seeing it here in Australia around First Nations young people.
Tareen Razik wrote quite a lot about that. Yeah.
So we need to look at that and look at even the way racism is occurring right now. So when those young women who cross the border into Queensland, constantly photographed, constantly images distorted. So this is the critical media analysis we need to do. And I wrote, I was interviewed for a Huffington Post article the other day, and I said, I said, when those people came off the Ruby Princess, no one said, here come the white affluent people off the Ruby Princess cruise ship. No, you know, so we've really got to interrogate who's using the language and for what. And I don't know if that's answered your question, Maria, but this is that kind of insidious and yet blunt stuff that we need to be aware of.
Umber, you seem like you were about to say something.
I'd really thank you, Maria, for mentioning that, because I read something about the almost the hypocrisy of mentioning those two girls crossing over to Queensland. The reason I think the media had the guts or something to do that is because they know that at the end of the day, such young women won't have much backing in terms of power and privilege to go up against the media, you know, from a legal standpoint. But they're very careful. For example, there was a doctor who crossed the border, I think it was from Melbourne to New South Wales. He was not named and shamed at all. There's been quite a lot of people who've done, I think there was some young white boys recently, I don't know if someone else knows the details about it, that had done something similar. But again, not named and shamed. So there's always and that goes to show the power differences. If you have power, the media will obviously be very careful not to name you and shame you, but they know who's going to stand up or help these girls. Probably nobody.
Absolutely. Thank you for that. Look, there's a couple more questions, and I'm certainly conscious that the time is coming, you know, up. But there's a number of questions. I'm going to group them together in terms of hierarchy and the danger of the hierarchy Olympics. You know, the Olympic oppression, rather, that Audre Lorde and others talked about, and that I started the conversation with. But the question here is, sometimes I worry about the idea of intersectionality creating a hierarchy of groups about who's better, who's worse. I, as a queer, white, middle-class, cis woman, I've both a range of privileges but also a range of disadvantages, and that's obviously contextual and so on. But is there a risk of turning this idea into who's more worse off competition? What are your thoughts on that? Mary?
I think it's the way it's applied. If you're applying it and looking at it as this additive approach, then that's not right. That's not the way it is. It is about addressing and analysing power and having a critical analysis on that, and what that means and how it shapes our society and our structures and our systems, and how that plays out in society. Like what Umber was saying, those women that then had their names blasted everywhere, it was because they were African women. And people were like, you know what, they're fair game. And I think it's recognizing that in society there are systemic issues, and when they are, or systemic discrimination, and when they intersect, for some of our people, they will intersect in ways where society can say and do what they want to further marginalize them and oppress them. And we can either choose to say, okay, that is a hierarchy of oppression Olympics, or we can look at this and go, well, how do we as allies in this space, and how do we live and breathe intersectionality really support this, and how do we actually address these issues and come together in solidarity and as allies to really like force our communities, force our society to think differently about it. I think we do this disservice again with intersectionality, where we talk about it as though it's this concept, it's complex, and that it's about looking at a hierarchy of oppressions. Actually, it's about us understanding our own positions. It's about us understanding our own biases and how we have been influenced within the system. And now that we know this, how do we get better? Like, how do we actually do better to make sure that we're not reinforcing power imbalances, that we're not being silent and allowing these things to perpetuate? And how do we challenge these things in ways where we can have uncomfortable conversations that actually enact change and don't take it personally?
So that divide between the role, I suppose, of the individual without the risk of individualism surpassing collectivism, I suppose, is always the challenge. Again, I refer to people like Angela Davis, who's always critical about the individualism, which often happens then where the hero narrative takes over at the expense of broader collective movements. But at the same time, she talks about the need for strong leadership, the need for, you know, willingness for us to model what it is that we're talking about out there. And of course, she's just one of so many individuals at the moment that, in my view, really exemplify the kind of leadership that we're wanting desperately, I think, around all the concepts that we're talking about. But if we're going to begin to address power and privilege as a collective, what's the role of the individual, and how do we avert the danger then of again pushing forward what we, I think, are resisting at this point in time? We're resisting the individualism, but not denying the critical role of the individual in collective change. Can I invite all of you as a way of sort of progressing towards the end of this, because people really are asking out there in our webinar, well, okay, what can I as an individual do to contribute to this collective reimagining of the possibilities that an intersectional lens offers us? What do you think? Maria?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I lost some of that because my internet went down, so I'm sorry if I'm...
No, but you got the gist of it. What can we as individuals do without risking individualism in the name of a collective reimagining of possibilities?
I think it goes back to, again, listening to people and to women, to whoever we're working with and living with. What do you need? How do you experience the world right now? What can I do as an ally? What don't you want me to do? I think we need to look at words like leadership. What model of leadership is being perpetuated? I wouldn't call it sometimes leadership anymore. In many of our universities, I would call it executive corporatization. You know, I wouldn't call it leadership. Is there unofficial leadership? I know when the Multicultural Centre for Women's Health was working in the towers, there were the women, the older women living in those wonderful communities were the leaders. And sometimes the government did not go to those women who knew what was happening in their in the buildings, in their families. So what is leadership? What's the unofficial leadership? As an individual, who can I support? How do I do the supporting? When do I step back? How do I mentor from my privilege? And what can I do in my local community in a bigger national discussion, bigger debates, and not just do talking, but actually get out there, be part of protests, be part of organisations. We all have our role to play, I think. But we need to listen to when it's not our role. I need to listen very carefully as an ally, for example, to Muslim and Jewish and a whole range of LGBTIQ people. I need to know when it's not my role. And how do I put my privilege to good use to undo privilege?
Thanks, Mary. Mary?
Yeah, I agree with what Maria has also said. I think it's also looking at how we as individuals have our own lived experiences, but how does it actually benefit structural change? And how do we have these conversations where we can go, okay, systemically, these things have happened to me. I experienced racism, I experienced these things, but how do we actually talk about this in a way where we can address these issues together? I think it's also about holding ourselves accountable to the higher standards. Like, I get very frustrated when people say, well, you know, it's on these people, those people are the bad people. And I go, well, you know, I haven't been the best either. Like, I can't sit here and be in a position where I go, well, you know, these things have happened, but I'm going to do to, you know, just sit here and not actually change my behavior. If I really want people to be better and I really want to do the things that I think are possible, then I need to live and breathe these things. I need to be able to say, I'm sorry because I have not listened. I am sorry because I have blamed you for something that's happened, and I need to be able to learn from my mistakes. I think, you know, to be a proper ally, it's not to be someone who says I will do these things. It's also learning from mistakes and being better, and that's what we have to do in a practical sense. We need to listen, we need to learn, and we need to improve.
Umber?
Yeah, I think it is difficult if you're just one single person out there and you think, what can I do? I think there's lots you can do if you want to be a good ally. And I know this will sound cliche, but acknowledge that there's a problem, that there is a problem with inequality, with racism, you know, at different levels in our society. So at least acknowledge, listen to those who are speaking about it. And if you hear things, call them out, you know, with respect within your own social circles. I mean, some people in our community do move around without interacting with any people of colour. I think so. It's important that if things do come up, you know, maybe someone makes a racist comment or say something that's inaccurate, you can nicely correct them, say, no, that's not actually true. And maybe in that way, just through your little social circles, you can enact change in a small way. And there's, of course, then there's like the other women have said, you know, joining protests. And the other thing I would mention is if someone is wanting to speak and you have a platform, maybe moving over and giving people a space and a platform if you're in a position to do that, because you can then help their voice get out and then, you know, influence greater change.
And Umber, there's a number of people that are sort of texting and messaging saying, oh my goodness, the struggle feels overwhelming. What continues to inspire this panel of people to keep going when it can feel so overwhelming? What inspires you, Umber, to keep at at the resistance, to keep that vision of what's possible at the forefront of your thinking?
Because I believe at the heart of everyone that most people are good people. And I don't think a lot of people who move around in this world who are in positions of privilege do so, you know, out of spite. They're just existing in systems that have been set up. So I believe there are good people, but we just need to get to everyone. And I'm never going to give up. I'm going into research soon, maybe with Monash if I can start it. So I want to keep showing. And I think the other thing I want to mention is about policy change. If we can get into research and prove that these inequalities exist and show it on paper, then that's how you can influence policy and change, when you show the real numbers, because that's the system we're in and that's the system we can work with.
Well, if there are people out there listening at Monash, Umber, we hope that that's the green light that's been given to you, because I can imagine the impact of your research. It would be truly profound. Thank you. Mary, what keeps you going? Where's the hope for you in maintaining the struggle?
I think it's about the long-term goal. The long-term goal is I've got 2 young children. I don't want them or others to be sitting through this kind of conversation 20 years from now. I think it's about, for me, it's knowing that I may not be the person that reaps from the benefits of this. And that's okay, because I'm doing this for collective gains, and recognizing that as long as I have people around me who challenge me, I've got a crying child in the background. And,
she's found her voice there.
She has, and who support this, it will make the biggest difference in the long running.
Yeah, thank you. Maria?
I guess I am in the privileged position of seeing so many amazing students come through, way back to the days of where some of them are very middle-aged with their own children now. And I can see them going into positions where they're doing incredible work. And over time, I turn 60 next year. The struggles, the situations are still ongoing, and I'm trying not to be impatient, but I've seen some really important shifts. I've seen a lot of younger people come in beginning from a very different baseline to where maybe I began. And I see my role as getting to a point where one day, when my brain doesn't hold out anymore, I want to be able to step back and say, right, it's okay. I've got all these amazing people who are going to go forward with this and take it even further than I could understand or fathom. So that's what keeps me going. And like Mary, I may not see all the outcomes of what I'd want to, of what we're working toward, but I've seen incredible shifts already. I've seen stuff that is too hard to shift right now, and it's really frustrating me, but we've got to keep going. Like Umber said, we'll just keep going, because things are shifting. And I think that's where we're getting some of the backlash, Maria. I think this is why some people are getting very uncomfortable and not happy, because the shifts are happening. They are happening.
I'm always so humbled and in absolute awe when I listen to incredible women like the women that we've just had. You've all dedicated yourself to not only collective resistance, and I think I see that daily in the work that we do, but that collective commitment to visions of genuine social change, I think, is truly inspiring. And the flood of feedback that we're getting is just a further testament to what extraordinary women you are. I know that you resist the idea as individuals, but it is that individual modelling in order for collective gain, as Mary said earlier on. I did want to sort of just end with just a very brief statement. Again, as you can tell, I'm a bit of a groupie with Angela Davis, and I can produce photos that also suggest that I'm a very serious groupie of Angela Davis. But she says, I can almost guarantee that if we build a society where working class trans Black women are free, then we've built a society where everyone is free. And that surely is what intersectionality is about. I want to thank you all again. I know that this is the beginning of a conversation that Harmony is going to continue to have. Sana, can I hand it over to you to maybe give us a bit of a brief overview about the next steps, particularly the next series of conversations that we're going to have. But again, thank you to all of you. As I say, I kind of stay on a high when I talk to Umber Rind, Mary Lee and Maria Pallotta about concepts of intersectionality. Sana, over to you.
Thank you, Maria, for being
Maria. Thank you, Sana.
For being a leader. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for the fantastic, amazing, incredible discussion and all the points. And it's just been really, really helpful to me to understand and work through a lot of these thoughts and issues as well, and that's what we plan to continue doing. As for the next steps, I see a lot of people have been asking if there will be a recording of this session available so that they can share with more people, and yes, absolutely, the session is being recorded and it will be up on a YouTube channel very soon, and we will also put it on Harmony Alliance website and social media, so please feel free to share it around. The next two sessions are going to be in a fortnight each. So the next one is 20th of August, which is going to focus on racism and sexism. But when we talk about sexism, we also want to talk about the intersections between racism, sexism, homophobia, and ableism, and how women occupying different positions are impacted by the overlaps, and also the compounded nature of those systems of discrimination, and how it's lived, how are those racist attacks that are attacks on different parts of those women's lives at the same time lived through, and what can we do to fight back on all of those fronts. So that's the next one. And the final, well, I shouldn't say final, because we have thought about 3 panel discussions at this point, but it's quite possible that we'll extend the series and we'll have more topics introduced later on. But the third one planned at the moment is about the use of language, which is something that was touched upon today, and it is really important to talk more about how complexity is used as a language to otherize. So the focus of the third panel is really on this phrase, complex forms of violence, that has been used quite widely in the government and non-government communication. Particularly speaking about family and domestic violence in migrant and refugee communities. So we really want to unpack that and the power of language in shaping who is the other and who is the, how can how is culture otherized in these circumstances. So please stay tuned. You will receive the links to sign up to those sessions if you have already sent an email to the Secretariat address, and if you haven't, please send an email to the secretariat@harmonyalliance.org.au, and we will send you the link once it's up and online. Also really happy to receive further comments and feedback on the intersectionality position statement we have released today. And as we said, I mean, I can see from today's discussion that there is a real appetite for more practical and applicable advice about how can intersectionality be applied in real life. So we are working on that, and this discussion series is a part of developing a more practical guidance for policymakers, for practitioners, and for the community sector, for people like us to be able to employ intersectionality in their own work. So we are getting there, but it's a collaborative process, it's a collective work, and it's a, yeah, I'm really happy to be a part of this amazing collaborative and collective work. That
a critical part, Sana, because we know that a lot of this stuff cannot happen with the tremendous work that you did to pull it together, and not only this one, but of course the others. And I always like to end by saying, without the Secretariat at Harmony, none of this would really come together. We would be a disparate bunch talking across each other, but bringing it together and making it seem so seamless. Thank you. Very grateful always to the work that you do. Appreciate it. And again, thank you to my wonderful colleagues and friends. You are extraordinary women who are contributing to such an important agenda. Thank you.
Thank you everyone who joined today into the panel, and thank you, Maria, for always being so generous.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.